Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description. The Devil Wears White. The ASL trio have been kidnapped, taken to a place that people only see in their nightmares. Children are tested on and lives are thrown away carelessly. How will they escape? If they do, who can they trust? And what's with these strange new powers? Now this is the season 1 of this fanfiction. It will have a season 2 where the same Luffy starts his adventure as from East Blue like in canon, but stronger and experienced. I don't own anything, adios.
Luffy and Sabou were running as fast as they possibly could, doctor's orders be damned, hoping they could reach their brother before things got too out of control. Sabou could hear the nurses talking about how Ace's heart rate was rising, how he was gaining consciousness, and so he and Luffy had bolted from their spot on the deck, ignoring anyone and everything. Faintly, Sabou realized that they were being followed, but he didn't care, as long as they got to Ace before things got too bad. Luffy was still gripping his hand, tapping it with his fingers. "Gear second?" Luffy asked. Sabou shook his head. Even though he wanted to get to Ace faster, he didn't want the pirates to know about Luffy's abilities. "Being followed, don't give anything away." Luffy nodded at Sabou's response, the two rushing down the hallway, remembering exactly which door was the infirmary. When they reached the door they knew to be the one, they practically rammed it down without any concern for the repercussions. When they were inside they were finally able to see what was happening. Ace was awake, that was for sure. He had his back to the wall, nurses standing in front of him with what Sabou was sure was needles, making his, and Luffy's, skin crawl. Their eldest brother was scowling at everyone, a snarl making its way onto his lips, his fists clenched at his side as he scanned over everyone in front of him. Behind Sabou and Luffy the other 3 pirates ran in, quickly taking in the scene as well. "You need to calm down, no one here is going to hurt you." Whiskey tried to tell Ace, voice calm but the needle in her hand setting the oldest off again as he flinched away from her. "Oh, two's awake," Thatch said, slight surprise in his voice. Sabou ignored him, gripping Luffy's hand tighter as the two tried making their way to the front. "Do you think that's such a good idea?" Izo asked, reaching to pull them back, but Sabou swayed just out of his reach, having expected the grab due to his haki. "He's our brother, of course it's a good idea." Pointing needles at him and telling him to calm down isn't going to help any more than throwing fire on fire. Sabou growled out, glaring at the pirates as he none too gently shoved his way the front. When they reached the front, Luffy examined his brother closer, noticing there was a weird feeling coming from Ace. Whiskey noticed the two in the midst of her trying to calm their brother down and hesitated. "I don't think you two should be here, he could be delusional," Whiskey said softly, not sure what the drug could have done to the man. "All the more reason to be here, we know our brother better than you do after all," Sabou said, and he was right. The nurses and pirates knew nothing about Ace and his abilities. Sabou was fully aware that the drug could have done a number of things to Ace in his brain, and he was prepared for him to be less than alright, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to help his brother, especially when they were surrounded by nurses with needles that made his skin prickle with unease. "Where am I? And who are you bastards?" Ace asked in a very Ace-like manner, causing Sabou to sigh and look at Luffy. The youngest was staring intently at Ace, eyes narrowed and focused, a slight look of confusion on his face. "What is it, 7? Sabou asked quietly, Whiskey's attention turning to them both. Luffy tilted his head, Marco, Thatch, and Izo making their way to the front of the crowd with them and watching Luffy as well. "His color's weird. It's like a weird yellowy green." Luffy mumbled, calm enough to drop his wall to see Ace's aura, noticing that the normal blue was replaced with the odd color. He'd never seen someone's soul look that color and he didn't know what it meant. Sabou frowned at the words as well, glancing back at Ace. "His color? What do you mean? His skin? It looks pretty normal to me," Thatch said, thoroughly confused along with everyone else. Sabou chose to ignore the man, taking a step towards Ace, who immediately turned his attention on him and Luffy. "He's confused, he doesn't know what's happening," Luffy murmured to Sabou. Sabou had told him a while ago that when Ace woke up he might not be the same for a little while because of the drug the doctors gave him, so Luffy had time to prepare for this, but seeing his brother look at him like he was a stranger still hurt. "Who are you two? Where am I?" Ace asked, and Sabou suddenly had a realization. He doesn't remember anything, not even us. Sabou signed to Luffy. Their brother was amnesic. "Your name is Ace, and we're on a ship, the Moby," Sabou said gently. To hell with hiding things from the pirates. He was sure he'd regret it later, but right at this moment, he needed his brother to calm down before he accidentally used fire powers he didn't know he had. "How did I get here, and who are all you people?" Ace asked, ready for a fight to break out any second. Sabou took a step closer, Luffy as well, and raised his free hand in a calming gesture. "I'm Sabou, and this is my brother Luffy. You're our brother Ace and we were taken to this ship so that we could get better. We were really sick," Sabou said gently, leaving out major details, but that didn't matter right now. All eyes were on them as Ace continued to glare at him and Luffy. Brothers? I don't have any brothers, Ace shouted. Luffy wincing slightly at the words and Sabo frowning but clearing his face quickly. But you do, cause me and Sabo are your brothers, and we love you, and you love us, and… Luffy trailed off, remembering the feeling of love Ace always sent him, the warmth that always calmed him down after a day of testing or training. He imagined sending that emotion to Ace, imagined that, if Ace felt that emotion, he would remember his brothers and what happened. What do you last remember? Sabo asked, trying to keep Luffy from breaking down into tears. Ace was still glaring, though it let up a bit as he thought. I don't know. I don't remember anything except… Ace frowned, glare gone completely. Except, Sabo said slowly, trying to get Ace to keep talking. Except wanting to be free, to get out. Ace mumbled, Sabo frowning at the words. We're free now, though, we're out, so you don't need to worry about that anymore, Luffy said desperately, eyes shiny with tears. All the nurses could see that the threat Ace posed was diminishing, if only slightly, and they began to calm a bit, some putting their needles away. They could see the clear signs of amnesia, but continued to let the brothers talk, continued to let them calm Ace. Whiskey was watching closely, Marco, Thatch, and Izo doing the same, ready to help if Ace became violent. At least we know their names now, Izo murmured to the other two, both nodding their agreement. I'm sure Oyaji'll want to hear about this too, Yoi, Marco said, eyes not leaving the brothers for a second. We're free? Ace asked questioningly, confused, almost like he didn't understand the concept. Luffy nodded rapidly, while Sabo nodded at a much slower rate. Yeah, we're free, we're not trapped anymore, Ace, Sabo said softly, watching his brother's reaction carefully. Luffy was still doing his best to send Ace the feeling of warmth when Ace's expression suddenly turned to one of pain, gripping his head in his hands and groaning. What's happening? Sabo signed to Luffy in concern. Luffy didn't quite know himself but did his best to explain it to Sabo. His color's changing again, it's trying to be blue again, and his wave is flashing. Sabo, I'm scared. What's happening to Ace? The desperation in Luffy's taps and eyes concerned Sabo and he released his brother's hand, quickly rushing over to Ace's side, Luffy following. Ace, what's wrong? Sabo asked in a hushed voice. Keep seeing weird pictures. Ace grinned out, teeth clenched. Sabo hoped that was a good thing. Maybe he was getting his memories back. He could see Whiskey edging closer to them and debated whether he should let her get closer or not. He didn't trust her one bit, but what if something was happening to Ace that neon? He wasn't a doctor, and as much as he wanted to keep his brother healthy and safe without anyone else's help, it was inevitable that they would need outside assistance. Before he had to make a tough decision though, Ace stopped groaning, letting go of his hair slowly and blinking, looking around with a frown. Ace? Sabo asked, hopeful, Luffy shifting beside him impatiently. Back to blue. Luffy informed, looking intently at Ace's soul. The yellow-green color gone completely, replaced with the normal blue he normally saw around Ace. Sabo, Luffy. What's going on? Ace asked, wincing when he tried to stand up straight. Ah, my head, what the hell did the bastards do to me? Ace asked, squinting his eyes slightly. Ace. Luffy cried happily, tears that he would normally keep back flooding to the surface and falling freely down his face. A bright smile on his face. He jumped into his brother's arms, the freckled man grabbing him tightly with confusion. Luffy? What's wrong? Wait, where are we? Ace asked, becoming defensive at the sight of dozens of people looking at him, some armed with needles. He glared at them. He didn't know what was happening, he definitely wasn't in the facility, and he was pretty sure these were doctors or nurses, so what was going on? Calm down, safe, for now. The tapping from Sabo caught his attention and he tried to force himself to at least look calmer. He had no idea what was happening, but Sabo was smart, so listening to him was his best option right now, whether he liked it or not. Ace, this is the medical staff of the Whitebeard Pirates, as well as 3 commanders, Marco, Thatch, and Izo. Sabo introduced in an overly formal tone that made Ace raise an eyebrow. That doesn't explain how the hell we got here when we were in. Ace cut himself off, not sure how much anyone in this place knew, and he sure as hell wasn't going to give them any information. They know about the facility, Sabo said with a sigh, Ace whipping his head to look at Sabo who raised his hands up defensively. Hey, don't look at me like that. I didn't tell them anything about it, and neither did Luffy. You know, he really took to heart what you said about not telling anyone anything. He didn't talk to these people until I woke up. They thought he was a mute. Sabo explained, smiling to Luffy who beamed proudly, and Ace did a double take at the pure smile that he remembered coming from Luffy. He hadn't seen him smile in months, and here he was beaming like the sun. He was still holding Luffy who had wrapped his legs around his waist, clinging to him like the monkey his name signified. Anyways, when Luffy got out he apparently ran through the forest until he found Marco and Thatch. He managed to get them to come help us and, don't make that look, he checked first, deemed them good colors. He brought them to the facility where they helped get us, and all the other kids out. Sabo continued. Ace still giving everyone a skeptical look, which Sabo understood. If he hadn't been trying so hard to stay on their good side he would have done the same thing. "Then where are the other kids?" Ace asked, glancing at all the empty beds with a frown. "They left today. The people in the town took them to their homes," Luffy said happily, trying to ignore the feeling of everyone staring at them. "We're safe?" Ace tapped the signal on Luffy's leg, away from anyone's view. Sabou and Luffy nodded, though Sabou signaled back as well. "For now. Staying on good side, hundreds of pirates. Captain is Whitebeard." Sabou tapped out, Ace bristling as he went on. They could barely handle the dozens of guards and doctors. Granted, they had been weakened with sea stone and malnutrition, but Ace still didn't like their chances. "Talk later." Ace signaled, wanting everyone in the room gone so he could be with his brothers, though none of them looked like they were leaving anytime soon. Sabou nodded. "These pirates have been nice enough to let us stay until we're back to full health. Luffy and I have been resting for a few days now, and now that you've woken up, the drug they gave you will probably be gone soon as well," Sabou stated, looking at Whiskey for confirmation. She nodded, stepping forward a bit, though Ace instinctively jerked back, setting Luffy down so they both had better mobility. Whiskey held her hands up in the air, a small smile on her face. "I'm Whiskey, the head nurse. I've been taking care of you three the past few days and, like your brother said, the drug should be almost completely gone by now. Why don't you go lay back down, you two as well, Sabou, Luffy, remember what I said about no strain?" she asked, sending the brothers a frown. They shifted under the look and Luffy felt his heart sink, the air getting harder to breathe. Were they going to be punished? Luffy really didn't want to find out, so he grabbed his brother's hands, frowning, and tried pulling them to their beds. Sabou went without protest, thinking along the same lines as Luffy, and Ace glared at Whiskey but followed along as well. "Stupid doctors, always ordering us around." Ace grumbled out, quiet enough so none of the nurses heard, but as they passed Marco, Thatch, and Izo they gave each other a look, having heard the words. The rest of the nurses dispersed, seeing as Whiskey seemed to have a handle on the situation now, while Marco, Thatch, and Izo stayed, following the brothers to their beds. The beds, as much as Luffy wanted them to be, weren't big enough to fit all three brothers in them, so Sabou went to his assigned bed while Luffy climbed into Ace's with him, having missed his brother and both the physical and emotional warmth he always gave Luffy. "I'd like to do a quick checkup if that's okay, to make sure the drug is completely gone and see if there are any other side effects," Whiskey stated, though the brothers had a feeling that even if they denied the checkup she would find a way to do one anyways. Despite this, Ace still looked ready to argue, but eventually complied when Sabou gave him a look. When he finally knew what the hell was going on, he would get them out, Sabou's plans be damned. They were so close to freedom that Ace wasn't going to let this stop them. As Whiskey performed the checkup, all three brothers watched her every move, Ace openly glaring at the nurse while Sabou and Luffy watched with much more neutral looks. Sabou had seen the nurse holding a needle when they first walked in and he wasn't going to put it past the doctor to pull it back out and give Ace a random drug now that he was awake. "Everything seems to be good. The only thing I see wrong with you is the muscle deterioration from your malnutrition, but with a few of Thatch's meals I'm sure you'll be back to full health in no time," Whiskey said, smiling to the brothers. "Ace, Thatch's food is the best. It tastes way better than the weird soup, and we get actual food, like rice, and bananas, and bread, and Sabou makes me eat the green stuff because it's healthy, but that doesn't mean I like it that much, but sometimes he gives us pudding too, and," knowing Luffy's tendency to ramble, Ace nodded, knocking the straw hat off his brother's head and messing up his hair. "That's great, Lou, can't wait to try it," Ace said with a strained smile, not intending to eat anything he was given anytime soon unless he or his brothers made it. Luffy grinned at him, picking up his hat and fiddling with it. It was quiet a moment, Whiskey having walked off after Ace's checkup, mumbling to herself about some paperwork she had to do, leaving the brothers alone with the three pirates at the end of their beds. Or, as alone as they could be when the room was packed with nurses. Ace's attention turned to them, glaring, and Sabou sighed. He just hopes Ace didn't piss them off too much. Now that the eldest was awake, he felt much better about his odds when it came to getting off this ship, but that didn't mean they were ready to take on the abundance of pirates that made up the Whitebeard crew. "Well, you just missed lunch, but I think I can whip something up before it gets too close," with a thoughtful look, drawing the brothers' attention back to the pirates. Thatch began mumbling to himself about different dishes, the brothers promptly ignoring him and turning to Marco, who looked ready to talk. "It seems that things worked themselves out then, Yoi," Marco said, arms crossed and bored expression still present. "It would seem so," Sabou replied, slightly tense. He had almost forgotten the fact that he and Luffy had run off in the middle of a conversation with Whitebeard. He only hoped the pirate captain wasn't too mad. "That's good, I'll tell Oyaji your brother's finally awake. You three should get some rest," Marco said, already turning to leave. Izo smiled to them, Thatch already out the door with lunch plans. "Get well soon," Izo called, waving to them as he followed the others out, leaving the brothers by themselves. "What was the issue, my son?" Whitebeard asked. A commander's meeting was being held, Whitebeard wanting a full update on everything that's happened recently. Marco sat slightly straighter in his chair. It seems that the two brothers were running back to the infirmary, and when they got there the third brother was awake. Yoi, Marco informed, Whitebeard humming and thought. And how did they know their brother was awake? Whitebeard asked, more to himself. Marco sighed, a slight frown on his face. That, I don't know. When they got there it was almost like they expected him to be awake. They weren't surprised at all. Their other brother also showed the same signs of fear as the other children, not wanting to be anywhere near a nurse or needle. Yoi, Marco added, Izo and Thatch nodding their agreement. The kid didn't have any memories at first, but when he got them back he was just as guarded as the other two. He didn't want to be anywhere near Whiskey or the other nurses. Izo said, face obscured by his fan. The third one also said something weird when Whiskey told them to get back to bed. I don't think any of the nurses heard it, but we did when he walked by us. Thatch said, still wondering over the words Ace had said. Oh, what was it? Whitebeard asked, the other commanders listening as well. Everyone wanted to know more about the kids, but they had all been so tight-lipped about whatever had happened in the facility that they weren't any closer to knowing than when they first found them. He said something about doctors always ordering them around, like it's happened a lot before, Thatch said, frowning a bit. Maybe they got hurt a lot as kids and always had to go to the doctors, Haruta suggested from across the table. Marco shook his head. They've been trapped in the facility for 7 years. Even if that were the case, why remember something like that now, Yoi? Marco questioned. Now everyone was frowning in confusion. Hey, weren't some of those people in the facility wearing those long doctor's coats? Jozu asked, remembering how half the people had been wearing guard uniforms and the others were wearing the coats. Oh yeah, I thought it was weird, Thatch said, thinking back on the appearances of the people. And there was that strange room with all that equipment, Izo said behind his fan. When they had freed the children the pirates had checked the entire facility, finding the lab with all the chairs and tables, as well as tanks full of water, and even the training room. It did smell oddly like the infirmary, Thatch said, scrunching his nose up as he remembered the smell. So were the people their doctors? Vista asked, confused. Whitebeard frowned. It made the most sense, why they would fear doctors, but what had happened? There were still too many questions, and trying to fill in even one of them was impossible. At the moment, our best guess is that the people there were doctors of some kind, Yoi, Marco said, Whitebeard nodding his agreement to the words. There was a knock on the door suddenly, everyone turning to face it. Pops, I've got the reports on the brothers. Whiskey's voice was muffled behind the door. Come in, daughter. Whitebeard's voice boomed and the door opened without further hesitation, Whiskey walking in and closing it behind her as she made her way to the captain, holding some papers in her hand which she handed to him. These were just finished not too long before this. The blood work finally came back. This was when we first got the brothers when 2 of them were still unconscious. The results on the right are the blondes and the left are the freckled kids. Whiskey explained, Whitebeard placing the papers on the table for everyone to see as Whiskey pointed everything out. What's it mean? Thatch asked, confused by whatever he was looking at. Whiskey rolled her eyes but explained. Well, this is the drug that caused the comas in the first place, and at this point in time, it was easily present in the bloodstream. The different compounds that were formed together were strong enough to put anyone it was given to into a coma, easily. The thing is, with how strong it was, those 2 should have been under for much more than a few days. Blondie didn't have much, so it makes more sense why he woke up so easily, but Freckle Face here got almost a full vial's worth, Whiskey explained. Though not many understood what that meant, they did know that it was significant. And? Haruta asked, still lost. Whiskey huffed in frustration. And, Freckle Face should have been out for months, maybe even a whole year with this drug, yet, he's wide awake on day 3. And don't even get me started on all the strange chemicals I found in both of their bodies. I don't have any of the youngest's blood, but I'm sure if I did it would be just as bad as his brothers, Whiskey said, picking the papers back up and looking at them as if she didn't quite believe them still. How is it possible for him to wake up after 3 days if the drug was that strong? Namur asked. Whiskey gave another huff, a look of frustration passing over her face before she forced herself to calm down. That would seem to be the million-berry question. The brothers were as alone as they could be in the infirmary, most of the nurses gone, though there were still a few mingling towards the front of the room. Ace, Sabou, and Luffy had been talking in hushed voices so no one could eavesdrop on them and they didn't have to read a bunch of signals. Sabou had been explaining to Ace everything that had happened while he was out. Luffy filling in bits he still wasn't too sure on, like how he and the pirates got them out of the facility. It was the day after Ace had woken up. Thatch had given him lunch as promised, Ace digging into the soup that tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten before, after some prodding from Sabou and Luffy. By dinner he was much calmer than he had been earlier due to Sabou practically yelling at him to be as nice as possible. Breakfast had passed much the same as previous meals had, and when all the nurses left the brothers found it the perfect opportunity to talk to each other. So they just let the kids go? Ace asked in a tone that screamed disbelief. Sabou nodded, Luffy listening but playing with the blanket on Ace's bed instead of contributing to the conversation. From what we know, yes, they were taken to the town on the island and the townspeople there brought them home. According to them, you need about a week or two to heal and they can't stay docked at an island too long, so they had to leave the island yesterday before you woke up. Sabou said, remembering that when they went to talk to Whitebeard they hadn't been docked at the island anymore. Ace scowled. You mean we're stuck again? Ace said, Sabou nodding. Basically, yes, but this time we have the upper hand. They obviously aren't too worried about us, we aren't cuffed, and they know nothing about our abilities. Their estimate for your recovery is already way off. You look back to normal already, and they don't know about you or Luffy having devil fruits. Sabou explained, and Ace nodded, hopes rising. There's a lot of pirates on this ship, but if we use the element of surprise to our advantage we should be able to at least get to a smaller boat somewhere on this ship and try and navigate to another island. But we're in the Grand Line, and even if we had a compass it wouldn't work here, Sabou explained, fiddling with his blanket. So, I'd rather be in the middle of the ocean than with bastards who are a word away from turning on us. Ace said, still scowling. Sabou sighed, shaking his head. You say that now, but what about when we're out of food and there isn't a single island in sight? Right now, these pirates are feeding us and keeping us healthy. All we have to do is play nice until we reach the next island. Sabou hoped Ace would see the reasoning behind his words rather than try to get through this with brute force. Sometimes it worked and most times it failed, leaving them in a worse position than when they started. We don't know these bastards. What if they spend months without going to another island? Or they lock us up like they did in the facility? Ace asked. Luffy, feeling the anger and slight fear coming from Ace, snuggled closer, trying to calm the temperamental brother. They're a big crew, Ace, they have to stop somewhere sometime, and if they do turn on us suddenly then that's why it's good to have the element of surprise. The second they try locking us up we fight our way to a boat and leave, but there's no use in leaving now when we're safer here than on a sea we know nothing about. Sabou reasoned, Ace falling silent while Luffy looked between the two. Fine. Ace said after a minute. But that doesn't mean I'm gonna like it, Ace said defiantly, crossing his arms and pouting. Sabou sighed in relief. You don't have to like it, just try not to be too mean to them. I'd rather we get as close to an island as possible before you start pissing people off, Sabou said, hearing someone coming towards the infirmary and signaling to his brothers who fell silent. Within seconds Marco was walking in, heading straight for their bed. Before Ace had a chance to say anything Sabou spoke up. Hello First Commander, it's nice to see you, Sabou said, smiling with practiced ease. With a plan set and his brothers all safe and healthy Sabou found it much easier to stay calm and put on a mask. Marco nodded towards them. Nice to see you too, Yoi. Whiskey told me all of you are good to walk around if you wanted. Same rules apply, she doesn't want a repeat of yesterday. Marco says, glancing to Luffy and Sabou, both doing their best not to fidget under the gaze while Ace did his best not to start shouting at him. We understand. Was there something you wanted? Sabou asked before the hothead could argue. He was slightly confused, he and Luffy having spent days in bed before getting an okay to leave. But Ace had been up for only a day and he was fine? He knew that the eldest was fine. But the doctor didn't know about Ace's healing ability. So why was he getting the okay so much sooner? Sabou ignored these thoughts, deciding to think on them more later, when Marco spoke up again. Oyaji wanted to speak with all of you seeing as we were interrupted yesterday, Marco said, clearly expecting them to go that second. Sabou bit the inside of his cheek, smiling. Maybe this was why he was allowed to move so early so they could go see the captain. Of course. We should get going then, Sabou said, hiding his growing discomfort as he turned to look at his brothers. Ace was scowling while Luffy was frowning, grabbing Ace's hand as they all stood up, following Marco out the door. The walk was as nerve-wracking as it had been yesterday, Luffy clinging tightly to Ace and Sabou's hands, sandwiched tightly in between his two brothers who were focusing all their energy on keeping their guards up. As they exited the hall they were once again blinded by the light, Ace looking up at the sky in wonder, not having experienced the natural light in years, unlike Sabou and Luffy who had experienced it yesterday. He was quickly pulled from his stupor though when Luffy tugged his hand, refocusing him on the many eyes that were on them. Marco was talking to the crowd, telling them to get to work, but it had the same effect as yesterday. Pirates only pretending to look away when, in reality, they were watching the three out of the corner of their eyes in curiosity. Sabou couldn't blame the crew for their curiosity, but that didn't make it any easier for them to make their way across the deck. Ace bristling in discomfort, ready to snap at anyone who so much as looked at them wrong. Luffy was shuffling quietly in between the oldest two, eyes focused on the ground as he tried taking in some of the emotions around them, looking for any signs of the darkness that lingered in bad people. He wasn't getting much, mostly just curiosity, but that was good, right? It meant that at least the majority didn't have the bad feelings and probably wouldn't hurt them. Soon enough they were reaching Whitebeard's massive chair, his commanders all dutifully at his side, Marco joining them like he had yesterday. Hello again Whitebeard, sir, Sabou said smoothly, politely, doing his best to keep his tone steady. Ace was biting his cheek to keep from saying anything, allowing Sabou to take charge and do the talking. Good morning. I'm glad to see that you three are all up and healthy. Whitebeard said, the brothers detecting nothing but earnestness in his voice. Luffy sensed the pure emotions coming from the giant and became ever slightly more comfortable. It was strange. The feelings that the giant man emitted made Luffy feel safe, calm, but he didn't quite know why. It wasn't enough to really calm him down. His stress and anxiety levels extremely high from all the attention on him and his brothers. But he felt just calm enough to bring down a barrier and look at Whitebeard's soul, squeezing Ace and Sabou's hands for reassurance. The two older brothers glanced at Luffy when he squeezed their hands, noticing the look in his eyes as he gazed at the giant, and they turned their attention back to the captain, tense, ready for Luffy to tell the murkness in the man or not. It's thanks to your medical staff that we were able to recover this fast in the first place, Sabou said, trying to continue the conversation and keep the attention on him rather than on Luffy. His voice was slightly more strained than it had been previously and he wasn't sure if anyone else picked up on it, but he had other things to worry about. Seeing as we were cut off yesterday, I'm sure you've got more questions, correct? Sabou asked after a pause in the conversation. Whitebeard nodded, humming in response. Yes, if you wouldn't mind answering some more questions I would be grateful, he says calmly, Ace and Sabou turning their attention to Luffy briefly who seemed to be finished looking. No darkness. Luffy tapped the words on their hands, calming the brothers ever so slightly, though Ace still looked ready to bite someone's head off and Sabou was barely holding himself together as it was. Luffy was going back to fidgeting, turning his attention to the commanders to try and determine their souls as well to see if they had any darkness. We'll answer what we're comfortable with, Sabou said, moving to sit on the deck, his brothers doing the same. Whitebeard nodded in understanding, everyone settling in for a long conversation. Why don't we start off simple? I've heard that you three have names, yet it seems everyone knows them but me. Whitebeard said with a smile, looking at the commanders who had been in the infirmary when they had given their names, Thatch rubbing the back of his head sheepishly and smiling. They had been so busy after the awakening of Ace and it slipped their minds to tell Whitebeard about them. Luffy, who had finished looking at Marco and Thatch's souls, was moving on to Izo's, discreetly telling his brothers that he hadn't found any darkness yet. Ace was, for once, remaining silent, assessing the entire situation with a watchful eye, ready to bolt the second he didn't like something. That's correct, my name is Sabou. Luffy here's the youngest, and Ace there is the oldest. Sabou said, gesturing to himself and his brothers. Luffy briefly removed his attention from Izo to look at Whitebeard and give him the best smile he could, which wasn't much, just a slight raise of the corners of his mouth, before turning his attention back to Izo, making sure the lady not lady wasn't looking at him. Ace nodded to Whitebeard, frown still present on his face. Sabou said he had to try and be nice, but that was easier said than done, especially when Ace felt like his skin was crawling and all his instincts told him to run, to get himself and his brothers out of the situation they were in. Two of them are 11, that's Ace and Sabou, the oldest brothers. Luffy's only 8, that's Garp's grandson. At the sound of the brothers' names, a knowing glint shone in Whitebeard's eyes, but he held the question in, for now, wanting to know more about the brothers before he brought it up. He smiled slightly instead, nodding his head. I think it'd be best to just ask the question on everyone's mind, that being, what was the purpose of the facility? Whitebeard asked, only a tone of curiosity in his voice, no malice detected in his speech or posture. To be sure though Ace tapped Luffy's leg, getting the youngest's attention away from the commanders and back on Whitebeard. A quick scan and a few taps later told the eldest brothers that Luffy hadn't felt any darkness either, which only slightly eased the brothers as Luffy turned back to the commanders, now onto the last 5 of the 15 commanders. They had yet to answer the captain, Ace, and Sabou having a quick conversation between themselves, debating whether or not they should tell them anything. We should at least answer something, we can't put off answers forever if we want to stay on their good sides. Sabou tapped quickly, moving his eyes to the deck in front of him, watching Ace's fingers out of the corner of his vision. But why do they need to know in the first place? It's not their business, Ace tapped back, just as fast, if not faster, also staring at the deck in front of him. Ace, regardless of whether it is or not answering them could make them angry. We aren't prepared for everyone on this deck to attack us at the moment. You only just woke up, you need at least another day of rest till you're ready to fight at your full strength. Sabou tapped, a slight frown working its way to his features. Who cares, I can still fight and that's all that matters. Ace tapped defiantly, almost huffing in frustration. Sabou's lips thinned. Ace, that's not the point. We can be vague, don't get too detailed, just answer enough to make them satisfied. Sabou tapped, trying to compromise with the stubborn fire user. Ace didn't tap for a few seconds and they were going on a full minute without responding to Whitebeard, the commanders watching them with piercing gazes, ready for an answer they had yet to give. Fine. Ace tapped, glaring slightly as Sabou rose his gaze back up to Whitebeard, Ace still refusing to look at the captain. Sabou removed the frown from his face and went back to a neutral look, inhaling as he felt Luffy tap that another commander was clear, no darkness. The facility's purpose is beyond me and my brothers. What they wanted was never clear and they never told us much in the first place. Sabou said coolly, fighting the urge to fidget restlessly at all the eyes on them, all the attention. If they didn't finish this conversation soon, he wasn't sure if he would be able to keep Ace at bay anymore. The eldest was gripping his shorts with one fist, his other hand holding Luffy's hand tightly in a vice grip that would probably crush the poor boy's bones if they weren't made of rubber. To be fair, Sabou wasn't doing much better either. Though his outward appearance may seem calm and relaxed, he was anything but. He was clutching Luffy's hand as well, maybe just as tight as Ace's, while his other rested on his knee, his face a mask of neutrality, but on the inside his nerves were jumping and begging him to run from the situation he was forcing himself into. Luffy was too concentrated on checking the souls of the commanders to give in to his nerves, but he was gripping their hands tightly as well, his face neutral, eyes piercing, literally, into the commanders' souls, making sure no one was watching him as he did. When someone did happen to glance his way, he quickly averted his eyes, looking at the ground and trying to calm his increasingly rapid breathing. Do you have any idea as to what they were trying to do? Why they needed so many children? Whitebeard asked, pulling Sabou from his musings. Luffy was finishing up checking the commanders now, relaying the message that they were all clear, no darkness in them, which calmed them all just a tiny bit more. No, all we know is that, whenever one child left, they were replaced with another, Sabou said, an edge in his voice at the thought, the brothers' expressions darkening. Left? Like, went home? Thatch asked innocently from where he stood. Ace didn't even bother trying to hold back the scoff at the question. Luffy looking back at the ground and Sabou shaking his head, frowning. No, no one went home. The only way you left the facility was when you were no longer useful, Sabou replied darkly. No longer useful? Thatch murmured, still not quite getting it. Dead. You left when you were dead. Ace growled out, Luffy beginning to tremble slightly, moving to snuggle closer into Ace's side for comfort. Thoughts momentarily forgotten, Ace turned his attention to Luffy, letting go of his hand and wrapping his arm around his shoulders, hugging him closer. Sabou scooted closer to Luffy as well, knowing the boy liked physical contact best when he was scared or nervous. Thatch, finally understanding what Sabou had meant, frowned, everyone else doing the same. What would the people in the facility do to the children? Whitebeard asked, wearing a frown of his own, though not directed at the brothers. The brothers couldn't keep the memories from flashing back of all the tests, trials, trays, tools, straps. Sabou shook himself out of those thoughts, turning and seeing Ace and Luffy's eyes glazed over, remembering the same things Sabou had. Luffy's trembling was getting worse, more visible to anyone, which was everyone, watching them, and even Ace was beginning to tremble ever so slightly, though you wouldn't notice unless you were right beside him like Sabou was. Letting go of Luffy's hand, Sabou tapped Ace's arm, trying to draw the eldest out of his thoughts. When he did, Ace looked around, a slightly crazed look in his eyes before noticing Sabou. Help Lu. Sabou tapped, turning back to the captain and clearing his throat, knowing Ace would manage to calm Luffy down better than he could at the moment. The people, if they can even be called that, did anything they wanted to us. If they thought of something, they did it, no matter the side effects. Sabou said, voice low though audible to those listening, tone dark and eyes swimming with anger. They used a lot of needles. Luffy's voice was quiet, soft, and timid. Everyone looked at him in surprise, not having expected the boy to talk, and Luffy himself didn't look like he had expected himself to either. And they made us eat yucky soup and we never got any good food, and they always made us sit in hard chairs, and they made us sick, and gave us headaches, and hurt us, and… Luffy. Ace's tone was hard, yet not mean. It was only meant to pull Luffy from his ramblings, and it worked, the boy blinking in surprise, looking around, before meeting Ace's eyes and frowning, leaning even more into his brother. Sorry, he mumbled to Ace, closing his eyes and trying to forget the fact that people were watching him, that they were asking about the facility, that they were surrounding him and his brothers, that if they said something wrong, they would be attacked. It was silent as Luffy's words sunk in, the brothers not daring to speak in fear that the pirates would attack. Instead, they waited for someone, anyone, to speak up again, hoping that they would finish this conversation soon. Eventually, it was Whitebeard who spoke up. I'm sorry that you three, as well as all the other children, had to go through something as horrible as that. He said gently, still frowning, though much gentler than it had been. Sabou nodded. I only have one more question, for now, one much lighter than the previous, he said, Sabou and Ace watching him carefully, Luffy still buried against Ace's chest. What is it? Sabou asked, ready to be done with this. He felt exhausted from this talk, the memories weighing heavy in his mind. Do you three happen to know a brat named red-haired Shanks? As the brothers made their way back to the infirmary, they were still left reeling from the sudden ending of their conversation with Whitebeard. They still didn't quite believe the captain and didn't know how to feel about the information they were just given. Do you three happen to know a brat named red-haired Shanks? Whitebeard asked, the three sitting up straighter at the name, Luffy's eyes opening as he raised himself off of Ace's chest and watched the captain with weary eyes. Once upon a time Luffy would have smiled brightly and shouted to anyone that asked that, yeah, he knew Shanks, he had gotten his hat from him. But now, he felt conflicted. They had been captured for 7 years, and although Shanks might not even know that he had been kidnapped, Luffy did. Would Shanks have tried to rescue him if he knew? Did Shanks know he was kidnapped? If he did he try to find him and his brothers? Or had he given up on Luffy? After all, strong people don't get kidnapped and held for 7 years. Did Luffy really deserve to have his idol's straw hat anymore? He had promised to give it to Shanks when he became the greatest, the Pirate King. But when he was in that cell he didn't see himself as the Pirate King. He saw himself as a prisoner, one that would never see the blue ocean ever again. Ace and Sabou looked at Luffy, worried about how he was going to react. They knew about Luffy's idolization of the man, the promise he had made with him, the meaning behind the straw hat, but how did the boy feel now? It was obvious by Luffy's silence and lack of exclamation that he definitely felt different than he used to on the matter. And why was Whitebeard asking? Were they enemies with Shanks? If they gave away their connection to the man, would they become hostile towards the brothers? Sabou didn't know what to say for a minute, looking at Ace with hesitance, though the eldest didn't seem to know what to do either. "Yes, we do," Sabou hesitantly replied after a minute of silence. The brothers were tensed, ready for a fight, sure that if they were going to be attacked it would be now. What they didn't expect was for Whitebeard to laugh. "Garararara, so you are the 3 brats that Brat was looking for after all?" Whitebeard laughed loudly, the commanders at his side looking shocked. Sabou frowned, glancing at Ace again, seeing his brother was frowning as well. "What do you mean?" Sabou asked, Luffy's grip tightening. "Red-haired brat came here a few years back looking for 3 brats, told me they had been kidnapped and wanted help finding them. It seems we've finally managed to stumble upon you 3. "Do you think he was telling the truth? Shanks was looking for us?" Luffy asked in a small, timid voice. Ace and Sabou glanced at each other hesitantly, Sabou turning a soft gaze on Luffy. "Who knows? Ace and I never met him, but from what you've told us you 2 were good friends. I'm sure he would have been looking for you," Sabou said carefully, not quite sure himself. Luffy remained silent, looking at the ground in front of him as they walked slowly through the halls of the ship. Ace's lips were thin as he held himself back from speaking. If the pirate had been actively looking for them, how come it was Whitebeard who managed to accidentally stumble upon them? He kept this to himself, not wanting to diminish any hope Luffy might have about his idol. As the brothers reached the infirmary they did their best to ignore the smells and nurses as they walked to their beds. Sabou could see Whiskey perking up from where she sat, making her way towards the brothers. Tapping quickly to alert his brothers, Sabou got into his bed, Ace and Luffy getting into their own bed as well. "Wonderful, you 3 are back," Whiskey said in a tone that unnerved the 3. Ace frowned, nearly glaring at the nurse, while Luffy clung to his brother and Sabou did his best to remain stone-faced. Seeming to notice the tension rising within the 3, Whiskey rose her hands in a peaceful gesture. "Don't worry, I'm only here to run the usual checkups, make sure that your little excursion didn't do more damage than good," Whiskey said calmly, the 3 slowly calming down, though still guarded. Sabou allowed himself to get checked over first, the nurse going through the usual procedures as before, jotting something down before turning to Ace and doing the same, and then to Luffy. "It seems you 3 are as healthy as this morning, if not healthier. You're making more progress towards full recovery as well, Ace. It's remarkable really," Whiskey commented, more to herself as she stared at her notes. Ace shifted uncomfortably, remaining silent. "Well, in any case," the nurse said, raising her head to look at the brothers. "I was wondering if I could draw some blood from you, Luffy, seeing as I don't have any of yours. I don't know if there are any chemicals that could be doing you harm running through your veins," Whiskey said calmly, voice steady. Ace and Sabou tensed while Luffy tilted his head in confusion. "Take blood with a needle." Sabou had the forethought to tap the quick explanation to the boy who had no clue what the doctor was talking about. When Luffy understood as well he paled, trembling slightly and clutching Ace tighter, frowning. Noticing this, Whiskey reverted back to the stance she had earlier, hands up in peace. "Don't worry, if you don't want to we don't have to. I just don't want you to get hurt anymore than you already have if we could prevent it," Whiskey explained in a soft voice. The 3 remained silent and Whiskey was about ready to just give up on it altogether when Sabou cleared his throat. "We understand your concern, but we're all a little hesitant when it comes to needles. I think it would be best if we didn't draw anyone's blood," Sabou explained as calmly as he could, though his voice did waver slightly at the end. Whiskey nodded in understanding. "That's all right, but if you feel any change, any new pains, dizziness, nausea, anything, tell me," Whiskey said sternly to Luffy, the boy nodding in agreement, the tone of the nurse's voice putting him on edge, Ace bristling at it, holding back a snarky response. Whiskey, pleased by the nod, turned her attention back to her notes, eyebrows knitting in confusion. "It is quite remarkable though, how fast you 3 seem to be healing, you especially Ace. At this point, you shouldn't even be awake, much less moving freely without any fatigue," she says, more to herself as she taps her pen to her chin. Sabou and Ace share a look, Ace doing his best to hide a smug smile. "Guess I'm just a fast healer," Ace said in an almost too cheery voice. Whiskey paused at the tone but shrugged it off, nodding. Guess so. Well, in any case, it seems like you three should be able to move around freely within the next day if you all continue healing at this rate. We could even talk with the commanders and Pops about getting you guys your own rooms. The nurse said, lowering the clipboard and smiling at the three. This was the best news the three had heard in years. Thank you, we appreciate everything you've done to help us get better, Sabou said politely, using his overly formal voice when addressing the nurse. He was grateful to the whitebeards for helping them recover, but who knew when they would turn on them? It was no problem, really. There is one minor thing, though, Whiskey said, raising the clipboard back up to her face. Ace and Sabou tensed, expecting this to be the moment that she whipped out needles and chains. Luffy, noticing his brother's emotions and feeling Ace tense up, glanced at the nurse, ready to start running if necessary. What is it? Sabou asked, voice slightly quieter than it had been a second ago, trying to keep it from wavering. Whiskey frowned, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Even though you're all eating properly, you don't seem to be gaining the right amount of weight, especially Ace and Luffy. Whiskey said, relieving Ace and Sabou, which in turn relieved Luffy. He didn't really know what was happening, but his brothers had calmed down, so Ed again, laughing almost sheepishly. Ah, well, Ace and Luffy have big appetites, Sabou explained, the nurse examining her notes another minute before nodding, jotting something down. Well, why didn't you say something sooner? If you were still hungry you could have asked for more food, Whiskey said in an almost chastising voice. The brothers didn't quite know how to handle the information. All their lives they were told to fend for themselves, and in the facility, there was no asking for seconds, even if you were hungry enough to eat another bowl of garbage. I'll tell Thatch to make you three some bigger meals, and if you want seconds, just ask, she said, smiling at the three. They nodded, still unsure how to respond, and she nodded back, turning and walking out the door, leaving the brothers in their beds, still unsure as to what had happened. I can't believe that those three were the brats that Akagami was looking for, Rikuyo exclaimed. The commanders and Whitebeard were sitting in the meeting room, discussing the conversation they had had with the boys, or more like Sabou, seeing as Ace and Luffy rarely said a word. Yeah, I didn't think that they would still be alive after all these years, Haruta muttered. I wouldn't be too surprised, Haruta, after all. This is someone that Akagami brat bet his arm on, Whitebeard said, grinning. Beside him, Marco was dialing a number into a Den Mushi, the snail ringing for a minute before there was an answer. Shanks here, who am I talking to? A voice asked on the other line. Whitebeard smiled, lifting the snail from the table and speaking into it. Brat, it seems you're still in good health. Whitebeard's voice boomed, the commanders falling silent as they listened. Ah, Whitebeard, it seems. Well, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call? Shanks asked, the snail copying his facial expression by raising an eyebrow at the giant. Whitebeard's smile widened. I believe we've found those brats of yours that you've been looking for, Whitebeard answered, the line going silent, the snail's eyes widening. There was a shuffling and a slam, like Shanks had placed his hand down on something wooden. What? You found Luffy and his brothers? Shanks asked, the background noise that had been loud and boisterous moments ago falling silent. Unless there's another Ace, Sabou, and Luffy, then I believe we have, Whitebeard answered. There was suddenly cheering in the background and Shanks was laughing joyously. I can't believe it, where are you? We'll come your way immediately, Shanks cried happily. After giving them their coordinates they found it would take the red-haired pirates a week to reach them. They ended the call, the snail falling back asleep. It seems that those brothers are pretty important to Akagami, Flamenco noted, crossing his arms. Everyone nodded their agreement when there was a knock from who they assumed to be Whiskey. They were right when she entered, holding her clipboard in her hand as she walked up to the table. Do you have news, my daughter? Whitebeard asked, everyone curious, wanting to know anything they could about the brothers. Whiskey sighed. Some news. I wasn't able to get any of Luffy's blood like I hoped, so I have no clue if he's got any harmful chemical in him. Otherwise, the brothers are all cleared to leave the infirmary tomorrow as long as they don't do anything to reverse the healing they've done. Whiskey explained, looking through her notes. Whitebeard nodded. We'll prepare some rooms for them then, Whitebeard said, turning and giving Marco a look to which he nodded too. Why couldn't you get the kid's blood? Was there an issue? Curiel asked. Whiskey frowned, shaking her head. No problem, but as I've mentioned before, every child that we rescued has issues with needles, practically a phobia of them. I don't want to upset the three when we can barely get them to tell us their names. As much as I'd rather get blood anyway I don't think it would be a good idea to force them into letting me draw blood. If anything, it would do more harm than good, especially if it turns out that there's nothing harmful in his blood. Our best option is to wait and see if Luffy starts having any new symptoms. Whiskey explained to the group. All of them nodded their understanding. It is a little odd though, how fast the brothers are healing though. Besides the fact that Ace was supposed to be in a coma for another month at least, they all healed at a much more rapid rate than I expected, Ace especially. Even after being awake he should have needed another week of healing, not a day or two, Whiskey said, frowning at her own notes. Is it a drug? Rikuyo asked, all of them confused. Whiskey sighed. I don't think so. All the drugs that were present when the brothers got here have dissipated by now. If there had been anything helping them, it wouldn't be helping them now. Also, Thatch, it seems we need to up the meal sizes. I thought it was weird that even with a regular, healthy diet the boys weren't gaining as much weight as they should have, Ace and Luffy especially. According to Sabou, they have large appetites, Whiskey said, addressing Thatch, who frowned, but nodded, almost mad at himself that he had let the brothers go hungry, even if he hadn't known about it. Why didn't they say anything? Izo asked. Whiskey shrugged. I don't know, I didn't push it. The three looked ready to bolt at any second, so I dropped it. The nurse explained, lowering her clipboard. When are we ever going to get some answers from these brothers rather than more questions? Curiel muttered, the commanders nodding in agreement. Anytime they got an answer to something, they got 5 more questions to follow it. All we can do now is make them comfortable. Red-haired brat will be here in a week's time, so, for now, let's get them settled, Whitebeard declared. I'll go have their rooms prepared, Yoi, Marco said, standing from his chair and leaving the room. This signaled the end of the meeting, everyone standing and heading off to do their daily tasks. I'll go start lunch, Thatch said, a slight frown still on his face, exiting the room. Luffy, you should try to take a nap, Ace encouraged, wrapping an arm around the youngest. After everything that had happened today, the brothers were surprised Luffy wasn't passing out at that moment. Don't wanna, Luffy mumbled, burrowing his head against Ace's chest. Ace rolled his eyes while Sabou watched with interest. And why not? Ace asked, wondering what answer the boy would give. I'm not tired, Luffy mumbled back, though his eyes were closed and he yawned. Your body says otherwise, Lu. Take a nap, Ace, and I will stay up, Sabou said gently, hoping his brother would listen and take a well-deserved nap. Luffy shook his head again. Nah, he responded. Ace huffed, beginning to feel slightly annoyed. Come on, Lu, just take a nap, it'll be fine. Sabou and I are gonna be right here the entire time. We won't go anywhere. Ace continued to encourage, trying his best to remain calm. Luffy was silent for a minute and the two oldest wondered if he had listened to them and fallen asleep. They were proven wrong though when he spoke up again. Can you tell me a story? Luffy asked, voice much softer and quieter than it had been before. Ace frowned while Sabou sat up a little straighter in his bed. A story? Sabou asked. Luffy nodded, still not opening his eyes. Like the ones you used to tell me before. About the pirates. Luffy said, peeking an eye open momentarily to glance at the blonde brother. Sabou looked at him for a moment before shrugging, standing up from his bed and moving to sit at the foot of Ace and Luffy's bed. Alright, as long as you promise to go to sleep right after, Sabou said sternly. Luffy nodded, a small smile forming as he snuggled further into Ace, getting comfortable. Promise. Luffy chirped happily, wrapping an arm around Ace and closing his eyes again. Sabou smiled while Ace smoothed back some of Luffy's hair, his straw hat symbol. Well, why don't I tell you about the gold-toothed pirates? Sabou asked, Luffy nodding vehemently. Yeah, did they go on lots of adventures? Luffy asked excitedly, always enjoying Sabou's stories. Ace settled into the bed more as well, interested in the story as much as Luffy was. He had to admit as well that Sabou had a way with storytelling that always made the listener feel as if they were experiencing the story themselves. Well, of course, what pirate doesn't go on lots of adventures? Sabou asked before launching into the story. It wasn't long before Luffy was sleeping peacefully against Ace's chest and Sabou was finishing the story, moving back to his own bed. I haven't heard one of your stories in a long time, Ace said with a yawn, shifting slightly, careful not to wake Luffy. Sabou shrugged. No one was ever in the mood to listen to them. Besides, we had much more pressing things to think about for the last year, Sabou said. You got that right. Ace muttered darkly. Lunchtime. The sing-song voice of the Whitebeard pirate's chef filtered to Sabou's sensitive ears, though you didn't need super hearing to hear the man coming. He practically kicked the door open, grinning ear to ear, balancing a tray of food in one hand and drinks in the other. Sabou sat up straighter, almost instinctively, while Ace roused their napping brother. It had been at least an hour, and while they wished Luffy could have slept more, they weren't complaining seeing as they were going to be able to eat. Thatch, what have I said about being quiet in the infirmary? Whiskey hissed, quiet enough that the brothers weren't supposed to be able to hear it, but Sabou was easily able to pick up on it. Ah, right, sorry Whiskey, Thatch said, still grinning and not seeming all that sorry as he made his way to the brothers. Whiskey sighed in annoyance, rubbing her forehead but leaving it be as she turned back to whatever she was working on. Hey, boys, hungry? He asked, lowering the tray of food down so the three could see what was on it. Luffy was slightly groggy, having just woken, but the sight of all the food made his eyes sparkle happily and he had to keep from drooling all over Ace. There was definitely more food than the brothers had previously been getting, but instead of just slightly upping the meal sizes, Thatch had gone all out, practically preparing a feast of different foods. Whiskey told me you guys seem to have bigger appetites than you let on, so I decided to make a lot of food. Eat however much you want, that way I'll know how much to make next time. Thatch encouraged, gesturing to all the food that was practically spilling over the tray. The tray was piled high with sandwiches, bread, bowls of fruit, rice, meat, and even vegetables that Sabou and Ace were going to make sure Luffy ate, no matter how much the boy complained. Ace and Luffy couldn't hide the loud growl their stomachs made. Ace blushing slightly in embarrassment while Luffy didn't pay it any mind, more focused on the food. "Well, go ahead, I made all this for you three after all," Thatch said, placing the tray of food on the bedside table in between Ace and Sabou's beds, grabbing a chair and sitting. Luffy, ready to grab the food, hesitated, looking at Ace and Sabou for confirmation first. Clearly, Thatch didn't think the brothers would eat all of this, so would he freak if he found out that Luffy could eat 5 times the amount on the tray in front of them? They had said they wouldn't mind making more food for the brothers, said that they should tell them if they were still hungry, but they didn't know that there were 2 black holes in Ace and Luffy's stomachs that could clean out their entire storeroom. The brothers debated amongst themselves on what to do before Ace picked up the tray, moving it towards him and Luffy to where the blonde couldn't reach it. Thatch watched, wondering what he was doing, but then he saw Ace dividing the food up, removing most of the fruit from their bowls, placing sandwiches into the bowls with the fruit, adding vegetables, rice, bread, meat, and then handing it to Luffy, who handed it to Sabou, leaving the rest of the food to the 2 ravens. Sabou nodded his thanks as he began eating at a normal pace, using his manners. Ace then divided the food in half and Thatch watched as the brothers began to eat at a relatively slow pace. He cleared his throat, noticing that he had been staring. "So, I heard you 3 should be all cleared by tomorrow," Thatch said, grinning again as he tried to start up a conversation. Sabou nodded and made a motion as if he was going to speak, which made Thatch wonder why he was always the one who talked to them rather than Ace or Luffy, because surely they had the same answers that the blonde had. So why not talk more? This was a question for later though, when all their attention was turned to the infirmary door that was opening. Marco walking in with his normal neutral expression, making his way over to the group. "Oh, Marco, hey," Thatch greeted cheerily, waving to the first commander. Marco nodded back in greeting, pulling up his own chair and sitting beside the chef, looking to the brothers who were watching him as they ate. Marco raised an eyebrow at the amount of food on the platter, turning to Thatch, who laughed sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. "I don't know how big their appetites are, so I just made a lot and figured whatever they didn't eat could go to anyone looking for a snack," Thatch explained, not noticing the smirk Sabou was hiding as he bit into an apple, or the way Ace slightly choked on his food in an attempt to stifle his laughs. Luffy was oblivious to his brothers, more focused on the amazing food he was eating. He hadn't eaten this well since they had lived in the jungle years ago. Marco sighed and shook his head, wondering if Thatch had also made it out of guilt for not noticing the boys' hunger before. Figuring it was probably the case, he let it go, turning his attention back to the boys. "I'm sure you've heard that you'll be free to leave the infirmary tomorrow. We're already setting up some rooms for you to use while you're here," Marco said, addressing the brothers. Sabou hesitated in taking a bite out of his sandwich, glancing at Luffy and Ace out of the corner of his eye. Ace had tensed slightly and Luffy, noticing the change in his brother's demeanor, slowed even more in his eating, looking around in confusion, not having heard Marco. "If you wouldn't mind, we only need 1 room, Sabou said stiffly, none of the brothers wanting to be separated. Marco and Thatch raised an eyebrow at that. "Really, it's no trouble to get you guys separate rooms. Besides, it can't be comfortable to try and fit all 3 of you into 1 room," Thatch replied. Ace frowned and Sabou tried to remedy the situation before Ace started shouting insults. They were still walking on eggshells here. They didn't need Ace burning those eggshells out from under them. "No, we'd much rather prefer sharing a room," Sabou insisted, hoping he wasn't pushing any boundaries with the pirates. After a second of silence, in which all 3 brothers had stopped eating out of fear of the response, Marco shrugged. "Alright, but the best we can do is get you a room with 2 beds," Marco eventually said, much to Sabou's relief as he saw Ace's tension leave and he and Luffy started eating again. Sabou held back a sigh of relief and smiled, picking his sandwich up again. "That's fine, Commander, thank you," Sabou said politely, continuing his meal. To be honest, he was surprised Luffy hadn't wolfed his entire meal down, even if Sabou had told him to eat slowly. Looking to his brothers, he noticed they were about halfway through the giant pile of foods. Thatch and Marco didn't seem to notice this fact, otherwise, their smiles and passive faces would surely be filled with shock and maybe even disgust at the sight. Sabou pushed those thoughts away quickly. "We've contacted Shanks as well, Yoi," Marco said, distracting Sabou from his earlier thoughts. Ace and Luffy looking up from their food in slight shock. Even though Whitebeard had said they would try to get into contact with the infamous pirate, the brothers hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Just like that, the tension was back, almost double what it had been before as all 3 stopped eating once again. "Oh?" Sabou asked, afraid he wouldn't be able to say much more and hoping the first commander wouldn't notice his nervousness. Marco nodded. "He said he would be here within a week's time," Marco informed without hesitation or emotion. It was hard to tell if the pirates liked Shanks or not. What if they were enemies of Shanks and once the man came they would hold the brothers as leverage, or even kill them? But what if they were friends? Why else would Shanks ask for these pirates' help if they were anything but friends? Unless he had never asked for help in the first place and was never looking for the brothers, in which case Sabou had no clue what he or Ace could do if Luffy found that out. The boy would be heartbroken, more so than when Emily had, Sabou said, hoping to keep up a calm exterior despite his many thoughts. He did his best to go back to eating, seeing Ace trying to do the same. "Make sure you eat those too, Lou," Ace mumbled quietly to Luffy, gesturing to the vegetables that had gone untouched by Luffy. Luffy scrunched his nose up as he looked at the greens. "But green stuff tastes bad," Luffy whined, forgetting his previous worry about Shanks altogether. Sabou chanced to look at Thatch, wondering if he had taken offense to the words by assuming Luffy meant the chef's cooking was bad. He could see the chef was trying to hold back the hurt look, but Sabou saw it nonetheless and frowned. "Not all green stuff tastes bad, Lou, see?" Sabou asked, making a show of picking a few pieces of broccoli up with his fork and eating it. Luffy watching with curiosity. Sabou saw Thatch's expression clear, the hurt turning to one of understanding, probably thinking now that Luffy meant green food in general. How could he have known about that horrible green soup anyways? "Really?" Luffy asked, picking at some of the broccoli on his own plate, and Sabou was glad the youngest was actually using his fork. "Yeah, remember that one time Makino gave us all kiwis? They were green and good," Ace encouraged. Luffy looked to be thinking again for a minute before trying the vegetable, everyone watching for his reaction. "I still like meat better," Luffy said eventually, though he continued eating the vegetables without any more complaints. Sabou and Ace smiled, Ace messing with Luffy's hair. "Of course you do. I don't think you'll ever like anything more than meat," Ace said, rolling his eyes, noticing the fond smile Thatch was directing his way and the slight curve of Marco's lips, hinting that the man found amusement in the show as well. Ace fought back a blush and glared, looking back to his own food, almost forgetting they were sitting in a room with complete strangers. "That's not true. I like Ace and Sabou a lot more than meat." There was no fighting the blush this time, Ace's cheeks practically a flaming red, Sabou smirking on his bed in amusement. Though Ace was glaring daggers at the blonde, Luffy felt the love and warmth coming from Ace. He could feel it from Sabou too, and Luffy basked in the pleasant feelings, digging into his food once more. By now the food was nearly gone, Sabou finishing his own bowl of food, pleasantly full for the first time in many years. Instead of shouting at the blonde, Ace opted to finish his food as well, deciding he would yell at Sabou later. It was at this moment that Thatch and Marco noticed the near-empty platter, Ace and Luffy eating the last few bites of sandwiches or pieces of fruit. "Why, you guys ate the whole thing?" Thatch said in the surprise that Ace and Sabou had expected, Luffy peering at the chef with curious eyes as he patted his stomach. He could still eat more because he was Luffy, a bottomless pit, but he felt much better than he had in a long time from having a bigger meal. Ace felt the same way, moving the platter to the bedside table, Sabou putting his now empty bowl on top of it. It was delicious," Luffy said happily, smiling brightly. He didn't feel any bad feelings from the chef or first commander, only wonder, shock, amazement, and curiosity. He didn't really understand the jumbled emotions but determined they weren't bad and decided it would be okay to talk to them. "Tea the whole thing? That was enough for 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 people. If they all ate seconds, I can't believe it. I've never seen someone eat so much before. And not to mention," Thatch's ramblings were cut off when Marco not so subtly elbowed the man in the side. Thank you, I'm glad you enjoyed it," Thatch said, and though he sounded genuine he was still clearly in a state of shock, eyes still wide. Marco looked to have calmed down, not having looked all that shocked in the first place, his eyes only widening slightly and his eyebrows raising. "No wonder you weren't gaining weight properly, Yoi. Do you normally eat that much?" Marco asked, the brothers only hearing genuine curiosity in his voice. "More than they know." Ace tapped out as an almost habit. Sabou smiled anyways, Luffy grinning as well, while Ace shifted to lay against the pillows comfortably. Did he ever mention how nice it was to finally lay on a real bed with real pillows and real cushion? Normally, yes. Ace and Luffy have a large appetite, as I've stated before. "I have a much more normal appetite, but after living with these two I guess mine grew a little as well," Sabou said, the last part coming out as more of an afterthought. He omitted the part where Ace and Luffy could actually eat 3 times that amount, knowing that, if the two pirates knew this, then they probably wouldn't be as hospitable to them. Besides, if they got this much food at every mealtime, then the 3 would be perfectly healthy in no time. "I can't say I expected large appetites to mean this, but I guess it can't be helped," Thatch said with a smile, grabbing the now empty platter from the bedside table, placing it in his lap. The day had passed quickly after lunch. The brothers had been left to themselves for the most part after Marco and Thatch left until dinner, when the chef returned with an equal-sized amount of food as before. After they had finished, the brothers decided to go to sleep, though Ace and Sabou took turns staying up, still uncomfortable with all of them sleeping at once in the presence of so many nurses and needles. By breakfast the next morning, Whiskey had cleared them, doing her final checkups. "Say, Whiskey said to Luffy, opening her mouth and sticking her tongue out, making the noise. Luffy copied it, making the noise, as the nurse checked that everything was okay. Nodding in affirmation, she leaned away, smiling. Well, that's everything. You three are healthy enough to leave the infirmary, but that doesn't mean you're fully recovered. I don't want any of you overexerting yourselves, and definitely no heavy lifting either. Also, if you feel anything bad, headaches, stomach aches, coughing, dizziness, anything, come straight here so I can make sure it's not a chemical causing the issue. Whiskey said in her stern voice. The brothers nodding almost out of habit, fear pooling in all of them at the order that reminded them a little too much of Haru's commanding tone. Good. Well, you're free to go. Marco should be here in a minute to show you around. Whiskey said, walking away from the brothers' beds. There was a collective sigh of relief among the three as they watched the nurse leave. Finally, I thought she'd never leave, Ace groaned, slumping back onto the pillows. I was beginning to wonder if we would ever finish our checkups. Sabou groaned as well, also slumping onto his pillows. Normally he was the patient one. But Whiskey had been thorough with her examination, checking anything and everything, the brothers still too scared of the possible enemy nurse to stop her. I'm tired. And hungry, Luffy said, laying against Ace. The checkups had been mentally exhausting for all three of the brothers, the nurse being so close to all of them, putting them all on edge, the brothers watching her every move, no matter how small it was. Breakfast should be soon, I hear them making it. I think I hear Marco coming too, Sabou said, closing his eyes as he took in the different sounds, better at filtering out the unnecessary noises on the ship. Luffy nodded. I can smell the food, oh, and Margot too. Luffy said, holding back the drool at the smell of breakfast, also noticing the scent that Marco gave off along with it. He had also gotten better at distinguishing certain smells of people on the ship. He had Ace and Sabou's scent memorized by heart, along with a few people from the facility due to being with them for years, but everyone on the ship had new scents that he was still learning. The only ones he knew for sure were Thatch, Marco, Whiskey, and Izo's scent. He also, vaguely, knew Whitebeard's scent, but he wasn't all that good. If only I had gotten X-ray vision too. Ace mumbled half-heartedly, not really meaning it. Sure, the enhanced senses were cool and all, but the cost they paid for them would never be worth it. Before Ace could ponder that much longer, the door opened and Marco walked in, beelining towards the brothers immediately. Ace and Sabou sat up straighter at the sight of the commander. Luffy still too tired to bother moving, knowing his brothers would keep him safe if something happened. Ready for a tour, Yoi? Marco asked in his usual bored tone. Sabou gave the man a smile, hoping he gave an air of politeness with the action as he nodded. We are. Whiskey just gave us the all clear. Sabou answered, removing the blanket from his waist and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, standing. He looked down at his clothes and wrinkled his nose. Though the brothers had been cared for quite well their entire stay with the pirates, they were still in their clothes from the facility, which wasn't much, just tattered off white shirts stained with blood and dirt, and even more tattered shorts, the same off-white color and covered in just as much dirt and blood as their shirts. They had no shoes or socks and they hadn't gotten baths either, so they still smelled overly ripe. Don't worry, Izo's been put in charge of getting you three some clothing. You can take baths after the tour as well, Yoi. Marco informed, waving off Sabou's concerns before the blonde even had to speak them. Thank you, Sabou said, gratitude behind his words. He was grateful to the pirates for everything they had done for them, but that didn't mean he would hesitate in forgetting that gratitude if the pirates turned on them. Beside him, Ace and Luffy were climbing out of bed, Luffy much more sluggishly than Ace, yawning again. Marco nodded again and turned, leading the way out of the infirmary. As they left, the nurses waved, but the brothers could barely look at them, much less wave back. Sabou forced a small, polite smile back, but that was all he could get himself to do, still extremely off-put by their presences. When the infirmary door closed behind them, the three brothers sighed in relief, some of their tenseness leaving their bodies as they followed Marco down the familiar hallway. Luffy was in between the two eldest again, holding their hands as they walked. The brothers could sense the many pirates out on deck with their haki and were unnerved like before, still not used to the mass amount of pirates on the deck. The four walked in silence, reaching the door to the deck quickly before they were opening it and walking out into the sun once more, something the brothers weren't getting tired of. Even after the few times they had gone out, it was just as good as it had been the first time. This is the main deck, Marco announced, gesturing to it as they walked. Ace and Sabou nodded while Luffy peered around curiously. He could see people doing chores, but for the most part, everyone was watching them walk by, curiosity in their eyes. Luffy hesitantly put down his wall, allowing everyone's emotions to flow into him, taking notice of the strong feeling of curiousness emanating from practically everyone, feelings of joy or boredom mingling in. Though those feelings were much harder to feel when there was so much curiosity overpowering it. This is a large crew, Sabou noted, glancing at the many pirates that surrounded them, body tensing up again along with Ace's. Marco nodded. Yeah, we're definitely not a small group, Yoi, Marco agreed. Ace was frowning, biting back his snarky comments and opting to glare at everyone, though trying to make it a less heated one than he wanted it to be. They continued across the deck, Marco pointing out different spots, like the spot where Whitebeard was sitting, watching everyone with a smile, or the crow's nests at the top of the giant masts. Eventually, they were finished with the main deck tour and heading to the galley according to Marco. "Smells good." Luffy tapped to his brothers, trying to hold back the drool, licking his lips. Sabou smiled, shaking his head, while Ace rolled his eyes. They entered, what they were assuming was, the galley, Marco disappearing into the room. The brothers followed quickly, not wanting to get left on the deck with the unknown pirates. The room was huge, though it had to be to fit the large crew, and they could see into the kitchen where there were cooks preparing lunch, breakfast having passed a while ago now. "Hey, Marco, oh, and our guests too, nice to see you three out of the infirmary," Thatch called as he walked out of the kitchen, smiling brightly and waving. The brothers fidgeted but said nothing as the man made his way over. "So what are you guys up to?" Thatch asked as he reached them. "I'm giving them the tour of the ship, Yoi. Oyaji wanted them to at least know their way around if they're gonna be here for a week." Marco explained, crossing his arms. Luffy, not having put his wall back up, felt Thatch's enthusiasm and happiness, the feeling rubbing off on Luffy himself as he started feeling jittery as well, fighting a smile that wanted to stretch across his face. Normally Luffy enjoyed the feelings of joy, practically fed off them, but he didn't want to make Sabou or Ace mad by acting weird, so he forced himself to put the wall back up, blocking Thatch's feelings and feeling that happy jitteriness fade away. Luffy let out a breath of relief from this, ignoring the quizzical look Ace sent his way at the sound. "Makes sense. Well, be sure to come back for lunch then," Thatch said, his smile never fading. Sabou put on his smile as the chef looked his way and nodded. "Wouldn't miss it," the blonde replied, flinching internally at the words. To be honest, he didn't know if he could force himself back in this room when there would be hundreds of pirates crammed in here at the same time, much less try and get Ace and Luffy to join as well. That was an issue for later though, no matter if he could feel Ace's glares burning into him from the corner of his eye. He also was definitely ignoring the taps that Ace was having Luffy relay to him, knowing the straw-hatted teen wasn't this creative when coming up with swears to yell at the blonde. "Why don't I show you three where you'll be staying, Yoi?" Marco asked, turning to face them, Ace spinning to face the man, wiping the murderous glare off his face within seconds, though he was still scowling. "Yeah, that'd be great," Ace said, ignoring the slightly shocked look that Thatch wore due to the fact that Ace had actually spoken. Out of the three, Sabou was definitely the one to speak for the brothers, and occasionally Luffy would pipe up, but it was rare to hear the freckled teen speak instead. Marco took this in stride though and simply nodded, already making his way to the door. "Well, I guess I'll get back to cooking then," Thatch mumbled, spinning on his heels and heading back into the kitchen. Ace held back a snicker at the sight by remembering his anger towards Sabou. "We put your room close to the galley and bathroom so you wouldn't get lost, but if you ever need help just ask. The commanders are also in this hall, my room is just there, Yoi. Oyaji's is down there as well," Marco explained, gesturing down the hallway, showing them his room which was 2 away from theirs and Whitebeard's which was at the end of the hall. Marco opened the door to the brothers' room and they walked in, scanning it quickly. There were 2 beds like they had asked, bolted to the ground to keep from moving when the ship hit rough waters. There was also a desk and chair, also bolted down, and a closet. It was a pretty spacious room, and the brothers would be fine with spending the entire week in there. "Those are all the important places you'll need to know, but again, if you need help, just ask," Marco reiterated, the brothers all nodding, wanting to be left alone. Marco nodded, glancing at the 3 again. "I'll come by when lunch is ready if you're in here, but you're free to wander around if you want, Yoi. Izo should be by soon with clothes as well." Making his way to the door. "Thank you, Commander, we appreciate all your help," Sabou said with a tense smile, wanting the man gone so the 3 could truly relax for a bit. With not much else Marco left the room, all 3 brothers sighing loudly in relief. "Finale," Ace groaned, face planting into the bed in the corner of the room. Sabou rolled his eyes but couldn't help but feel the same way. This was the first time the brothers had been left alone the entire time they had been on the ship, always having been in a room with a nurse. "This room smells a lot better than the medicine room," Luffy said in a pleased manner, smiling as he looked around the room, pulling out the drawers of the desk and poking his head in the empty closet. "And it's much quieter," Sabou said happily, closing his eyes and relishing in the fact that if he drowned out the noises outside of the room it was blissfully silent. Ace rolled his eyes. "I'm just happy we're away from those damn nurses," Ace said, flipping onto his back and staring at the ceiling, arms behind his head and legs crossed. "Nay, Ace," Luffy cried cheerfully, running and jumping onto the man's stomach, causing him to make an oof noise. "What, Luffy?" Ace groaned out, wincing a little at the sudden impact but containing himself. "I like this place a lot better than the facility. They feed us and help us, and they're gonna give us clothes, and we can take baths." "Since when did you like baths?" Sabou asked, interrupting the rambling boy. Luffy paused, turning to look at him with a look of confusion as if wondering the same himself. I dunno. You guys stink though. Luffy said, scrunching his nose up at the reminder. Sabo laughed while Ace rolled his eyes. Well duh, he muttered, but Luffy either didn't hear or didn't care. Anyway, the chef is always happy too, and when I feel people's emotions they're happy too, except Margo, he's always muddled, like he's bored, but sometimes there's a little bit of happy in it, oh, and the warm feeling too. Luffy continued. Before responding, Sabo tapped out that he could hear someone coming their way, Izo, before changing the subject. We should take baths when we get our new clothes, so we don't have to keep smelling each other, Sabo said, scrunching up his own nose at the thought. Though they didn't have Luffy's sense of smell, Ace and Sabo could still smell how bad they smelled. For once, I can't wait to have a bath, Ace said, pushing Luffy off his stomach and sitting up, ready for their visitor to knock at any moment. I feel gross, Luffy whined, pulling at his shirt and grimacing at himself. Finally, Izo reached their room, a knock resounding as Sabo put on a smile, opening the door. As expected, Izo stood there holding a neatly folded pile of clothing. Hello there boys, I brought you all a new set of clothing. There are a few extra shirts and things for throughout the week, but there isn't much, after all. I didn't have the material to make a whole new wardrobe from scratch, Izo said, handing the pile to Sabo who took them, placing them on the bed to sort later. Thank you, Commander, we appreciate your kindness, Sabo said with another polite smile. Being on this pirate ship for so long was a real test to Sabo's abilities to put on different masks. It was no problem. You can go take baths now if you'd like. There's no one in the bathroom at the moment. I made sure, I didn't think you three would be wanting any company, Izo said, pulling out a fan and hiding his face. The brothers did relax marginally at the information, not having thought about that little fact. You're definitely right about that. Thank you again, Commander, Sabo said, this time meaning it a little more than he had the first time. Izo smiled, though it was obscured by the fan, and nodded, turning and leaving the room with a wave. Another sigh of relief escaped Sabo as he closed the door, turning to face his brothers. Well, I guess we should hurry and bathe before anyone decides they want to as well, Sabo said, moving to the pile of clothes they had been given and sorting them. He was actually slightly amazed that they looked to be the right sizes for the brothers and sorted them according to that, making 3 piles for each brother. Deciding to hang them all up later, Sabo pulled a shirt and pants for each brother out, as well as towels that were at the bottom of the pile and cradling them all carefully. Alright, let's go, Sabo said to his brothers, the two nodding and following him closely out the door, scanning their surroundings rapidly. There was no one in the hall, so they weren't stopped on their way to the bathroom, the 3 rushing in and closing the door quickly behind them. Finally, time for a bath, Ace exclaimed happily, already throwing his ruined shirt off, moving to heat the water up, courtesy of his firepower. Sabo rolled his eyes but also removed his shirt. Come on Lou, we better stop the hothead before he makes the water too hot, Sabo said, Luffy nodding with a bright grin. As Luffy removed his shirt, Sabo couldn't help but notice the burn marks covering his brother's shoulder from tests Haru had performed. All 3 brothers had lasting scars from that place, and Sabo was grateful Luffy's devil fruit kept him from getting anything more than scars from burns. But it still made his blood boil in anger as he looked at the marks. He and Ace had plenty of burns and scars littering their chests and arms, but they had always done their best to ignore them, pretend they weren't there. The brothers bathed in relative silence, all of them enjoying the relaxing heat soothing their sore muscles. They took turns washing each other's hair for each other, Sabo in charge of making sure Luffy and Ace didn't sink under the water, and by the end of the bath they were finally clean and feeling better than they had since they had been kidnapped. Man, I feel great, Ace cried happily, stretching his arms wide over his head as he stepped out of the bath, wrapping a towel around himself and using his devil fruit to heat his body up and dry himself. And we all smell good again. Luffy cheered just as happily, accepting Sabo's help out of the tub, slightly sluggish from a mix of the water and having already been tired before the bath. Sabo smiled and laughed a little at the two but got out as well, moving towards their new clothes. It seems Izo is pretty good at making clothes. These are all our sizes, Sabo said, tossing Ace and Luffy their clothes while taking his own. Ace had gotten a yellow button-down shirt with short sleeves that he didn't bother buttoning and black shorts that reached his knees with an orange belt and brown boots that he happily slipped on. Sabo had gotten a blue button-down shirt with long sleeves and a pair of light blue pants with black boots. Luffy had been given a blue tank top with the numbers 56 on it in white and blue jean shorts and sandals which Luffy slipped on happily, swinging his feet from where he sat on a bench, waiting for Ace and Sabo. Do you think we could fit in a nap before lunch? Ace asks, stretching again, the relaxing bath making him tired. Sabo shrugged. Maybe, we should head back to our room now anyway, Sabo said with a shrug, picking up their towels and destroyed clothes. Ace and Luffy nodded their agreement and followed Sabo out the door, the 3 moving quickly back into their room. Luffy and Ace immediately went to the bed, laying down and falling asleep almost instantly, leaving Sabo to deal with all the clothes. Sabou shook his head but smiled nonetheless as he began hanging their clothes up, looking around their small room again before sitting on the unoccupied bed. Now we just had to get through the rest of the week.